hallelujah, shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah unto the Lord. Shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah unto the Lord. Sing aloud to God, let the people shout before his throne. Hallelujah, sing aloud.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for our Wednesday night Bible study together. We are continuing our journey through the back half of Genesis, and tonight we're going to start the story of Joseph, which is one of the most well-known, most amazing narratives in the book of Genesis and really in all the Bible. It's also one of the longest. The story of Joseph begins in Genesis chapter 37, which is where we're going to begin tonight, and goes throughout the rest of the book of Genesis until chapter 50, with a couple chapters that don't include Joseph. But for the most part, Genesis 37 through 50 is the story of Joseph, and it is an amazing one, and we begin it tonight. So if you don't have one of our books that we've been studying, then feel free to grab a Bible. I'd encourage you to grab a Bible and go with me to Genesis chapter 37. If you do have one of these books, we begin on page 68. So let's read God's Word together, and let's make some observations along the way about what this account reveals to us about God and how He is working in human history to bring about His purposes. So we begin in Genesis chapter 37, verse 1, where we read, "Now Jacob, Joseph's father, dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger in the land of Canaan." So we are once again beginning with Jacob. We've really wrapped up the bulk of his story last week. But this first verse of Genesis chapter 37 includes an important detail, and that is that Jacob, the father of Joseph, has made his way into the land of Canaan and is dwelling there. There is an important point made about this verse in your book on page 72, and I like to read a lot of what the commentators quoted in the book have to say, because they're smarter than I am and they have better words than I often do. And one commentator, Sailhammer, notes this. This is quoted in your workbook. "The writer's point here is to show that the promises of God had not yet been completely fulfilled, and that Jacob, as his fathers before him, Isaac and Abraham, was still awaiting fulfillment." It notes that, yes, Jacob is living in the land of Canaan, the promised land, but he had not always lived there. And it was a land in which his father and grandfather found themselves as strangers. And so it's a reminder that the promise God made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12 is yet unfulfilled. He goes on to say, it is from a verse such as this that the New Testament writers read the lives of the patriarchs as aliens and strangers on earth. That's Hebrews chapter 11. The verse also provides a fitting transition to the next section, the Joseph narratives, which trace the course of events by which the sons of Jacob left the land of promise and entered the land of Egypt. So in the story of Joseph, we learn about how Jacob and his family wind up in the land of Egypt, how they leave Canaan and spend many years in Egypt. And so this here is a reminder of where we are when we begin Joseph's story. We're in the land of Canaan. Let's keep reading in verse 2. "This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father." Now, I think it's important that we do not read into this verse a motivation on Joseph's part. Yes, we can speculate, and I have probably said before in teaching class, it sounds as if Joseph is being a tattletale here, that, he's kind of telling on his brothers, but it may be that Joseph had good reason to speak to his father about what his brothers were up to. Maybe it was a noble reason here. But this verse is setting up the tension between Joseph and his brothers that drives the narrative of this chapter, whether his motivations here were good or bad. He brings a bad report of them to his father Jacob. Now Israel, verse 3, Israel, as we learned last week, was the name that God, the new name that God gave Jacob, the name by which Jacob's family and this nation would come to be called, Israel or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. Jacob himself, as you may remember, was a favorite child of his mother. And now Jacob himself has a favorite, and it's Joseph, his 11th born of 12 children, the first born to his most beloved wife, Rachel. Maybe that has something to do with it. The text tells us that Joseph was the son of his old age, Jacob's old age, and he made him a tunic of many colors, which is one of the most famous details about Joseph, something that most people recognize right away about Joseph. He had a coat of many colors, and it was made for him as a token of love by his father. And so all of this is setting up what's about to happen. Joseph has a fraught relationship with his brothers. He is giving a bad report to his father about them, and his father loves him more than any of his other children. And we're about to see what this difficult family relationship brings about in the next few verses. Verse 4. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him, Joseph, more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. They despised him to the point that they could not even say a kind word to him. Now, your book brings out that there has been conflict before in this family. And if we just look back to previous lessons in this series, we've talked about conflict between Abraham and Sarah, between Isaac and Ishmael, between Jacob and Esau. And then we didn't talk about the conflict that existed between Rachel and Leah, the mother of Joseph, Rachel, and Leah, who was also a wife, both wives of Jacob. Your book talks about this on pages 70 and 71. The conflict between Joseph and his brothers was not the first to afflict Jacob's family, for it resembled the conflict that previously existed between their mothers, Rachel and Leah. After Leah bore 4 sons to Jacob, Rachel envied her and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Knowing the matter was beyond his control, Jacob responded, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Whether intentional or not, Jacob's question anticipated the birth of Joseph, one whom God would use to save the family of Jacob. Eventually, God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." So there was conflict in this family between Rachel and Leah, sisters and wives of Jacob. And now there's conflict between Joseph, the firstborn child, son of Rachel, and his brothers who had been born of Leah, and also Bilhah and Zilpah, who were also wives of Jacob. That's one of the main problems here. Jacob has too many wives, too many mothers of his children. The conflict remains between Joseph and his brothers, and what's about to happen makes it even worse. Verse 5, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed." Now, what do we make of Joseph here? Is he being intentionally obnoxious? Is he naive here in thinking that his brothers will be impressed by the dream? Or is this all a part of God's providential plan to bring about the events of the story of Joseph? Maybe all the above. It's hard to know. At any rate, he shares this dream with them. He says, "There we were," verse 7, "binding sheaves in the field, and then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to mine." Now, how do you think his brothers are going to respond? Well, the Bible's already told us. The result is they hate him even more. And they say to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" Well, if you know the story of Joseph, You know, the answer to those questions is yes, in fact, he will. Joseph will, in years to come, reign over them, be in a leadership position over them. So the dream is offensive to his brothers, and it makes them angry, but it's true. It's accurate. What Joseph dreams here does come to pass in years to come. Again, we are told for the upteenth time in verse 8, they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Well, watch this. Then he dreamed still another dream, and he told it to his brothers. You'd think he'd learn not to repeat these dreams to his brothers, but he says to them, look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. And he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? So Jacob takes this dream to mean that he and Rachel represent the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, the 11 brothers of Joseph. And he fusses at Joseph for dreaming this, for sharing this dream, and says, what do you think is going to happen, son? That we're all going to bow down to you. His brothers envied him, verse 11. But his father kept the matter in mind. Verse 12. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel, or Jacob, said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. And so Joseph does not hesitate. He fulfills the wishes of his father here. And he said to him, please go. Jacob says to his son Joseph, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring word back to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now, this wasn't just, over yonder. This wouldn't just cross over the nearest hill and they're in the next holler. This was a 50-mile journey from the valley of Hebron to Shechem. So it's going to take Joseph a little while to get there. Verse 13 verse 15 rather, of Genesis 37. I hope you're still following along with me in your Bible. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? And he said, I'm seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan, which is, by the way, another 13 miles from where he currently is. But let's pause right here and talk about this man, this mysterious man that makes his appearance in this story in Genesis chapter 37. I want to share something that the book has to say about him. The text does not identify this man, but one commentator observes the man's overhearing of the brothers' plan is one of the providential elements in the story. In other words, it is a detail that God uses to advance the story here, to guide Joseph to his brothers where God's will be done. We don't know who he is. The scriptures don't identify him, but interestingly, Jewish tradition identified the man as an angel. This is possible but uncertain, this commentator says. So maybe it was, but we're not told that explicitly in the scriptures. Earlier in the book, Abraham, Lot, and Jacob each encountered angels who appeared to be men. So maybe this is likewise an angel appearing to be a man before Joseph. We don't know. But it is an interesting detail found here in the story of Genesis chapter 37. And the man's role, whether he's an angel or not, is vital in getting Joseph to meet up with his brothers down in Dothan. So we find Joseph in Dothan, and he finds his brothers. And now, just a few verses left to cover. Verse 18. When they saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. So their anger has reached a point that they want to murder their brother. And this should call our minds back to a couple other brothers much earlier in the narrative of Genesis, Cain and Abel. Cain, whose anger got away from him and desired to murder and did murder his brother. Now, Joseph's brothers see him coming. Maybe they recognize that coat of many colors that Jacob made for him because he was their father's favorite. Maybe they see him coming because of the coat, and their anger rises up in their hearts, and they conspire to kill him. And they say to one another, verse 19, look at the dreamer who's coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. And so this is an evil plot here in the works to kill their own brother Joseph. And we read in the book, one commentator says, the cumulative effect of the open favoritism of Jacob and Joseph's interactions with him has borne its fruit, a terrible fruit. Resentment unchecked is about to spill over into violence. Their plan is to murder Joseph and throw his body into a cistern and tell Jacob that he was devoured by an evil animal. They think that in so doing, they'll be able to falsify Joseph's dreams. In fact, as the ensuing narrative will show, they are actually assisting in the fulfillment of those resented dreams, or at least one of them. So they think they're going to destroy Joseph, but in reality, and we're going to see how this plays out in weeks to come, in reality, they are helping to advance the very plan of God. I love what the book says here. When the brothers attempted to thwart Joseph's dreams, they actually expedited them. They think they're destroying the dreamer when in fact they're helping to fulfill the dream. It's amazing how God is working throughout this story, and it begins right here in Genesis chapter 37. God is providentially working to bring about his plans and purposes. But Reuben, 2 verses left, verse 21, but Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, let's not kill him. So Joseph's oldest brother says, let's not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him. And we're told here by the scriptures, Reuben did this that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So Reuben was hoping he could talk his brothers out of killing him, which he does, so that he could then come back and take Joseph out of the pit and take him back to his father Jacob. But if you know the story, you know that Reuben was not able to do that, because before he could get back, Joseph was sold into slavery, carted off to Egypt, and that results in his brothers conspiring to trick their father that Joseph had been devoured by an animal. Now we're going to see how the rest of the story of Joseph plays out in future weeks, but to close out this week, let me just give you a little preview of what is to come in the life of Joseph. This is from a commentator, pages 71 and 72, a quote in your book. The focus of the narrative is upon Joseph as the one who brings life, the mediator of Yahweh's blessing to the rest of humanity. When everyone else is in dire need and dying of famine, Egypt under Joseph is the fount of life and food to which nation all the earth comes. He is the instrument of salvation, a fact Joseph himself is not unaware of. Thus, Joseph's life is intricately tied in with his being the agent of God's blessing to the world. Both Joseph's family and the nation, as well as all the earth, are blessed by Yahweh through him. All the earth blessed by God through him. That sounds an awful lot like what God promised to Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham, and what God repeated to Joseph's grandfather Isaac, his father Jacob. Through Joseph, God blesses all the nations of the earth, and we're going to see how that comes to pass. But interestingly, and we'll talk more about this in the future, it is not through the bloodline of Joseph that Jesus eventually arrives. It is through Judah's line. And so Joseph is very much outside the lineage that produces Jesus Christ. And yet, in many ways, he is a figure in the Old Testament very akin to Jesus, in that God uses him to bring about blessing for all the nations of the world. And we'll see how that plays out. But suffice it to say, God uses a lot of difficult experiences in order to bring this about. The first of which is the near murder of Joseph and his being tossed into a pit and sold into slavery. Well, that's all for tonight's lesson. Thank you so much for joining me on this first leg of Joseph's journey. We'll continue his fascinating story from the Bible, a story in which God is really the main character working behind the scenes. We'll continue that, the rest of the story, next week, and I look forward to seeing you then. Have a blessed evening.
Make a joyful noise unto the Lord. Shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah unto the Lord. Shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah, shout hallelujah unto the Lord from the ends of the